Good morning, Andre. If you can just indicate if everyone has logged in, and then we can proceed with the meeting.
Hi, good morning, Chair. I will do a roll call of members so that they can indicate the present Chair. Mr. Chance?
If you can
yes,
also
I'm
see,
present.
if you can
present.
see,
Good morning.
sorry, members, if you can kindly see all of you, because we're on Zoom just once, so that we can then proceed properly.
Okay, I've switched on my video.
Recording in progress.
Mr. Chance?
Yes, can you see me?
No.
Okay, I have switched on my video. Maybe just go on to somebody else and see. My video does appear to be working.
No problem. Mr. Mkutu? Mr. Mkutu is on the platform. He may have the same challenge. Dr. Nglozi?
Nglozi here.
Mr. Kigaba?
I'm here, present.
Mr. Mndludli?
Hi, Chair. Hi, Secretary. I'm trying to switch on my camera, but there's a bit of a problem, I think, because of bandwidth, but I'm here, present. Thanks.
Okay. Mr. Mesizane?
Present, Secretary.
Chair, those are all members currently on the platform that I can see that we have, although may not see them, but they have indicated their presence, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm also present, so that members don't think I'm absent. Thank you.
Chair, if I may, through you, Chair, ask Margaret to share the agenda, Chair.
Yes, if it can be flighted. Thank you very much, colleagues. Let's welcome the officials who are here. Welcome members from the startup that I will be presenting today. And thank you very much for accepting our request, because Parliament is effectively on recess, so members were all over. It was going to be difficult to have a physical meeting, and we felt that this meeting is very, very important. This meeting is officially opened. Are there any official apologies, Andre?
Chair, I have not. The only apology that I've received, Chair, was from Mr. Thring and Ms. Zuma Sambudla, who's
Andre, are there any apologies?
Chair, can you hear me, Chair? Chair, can you hear me? Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, we have two apologies from Mr. Thring and Ms. Zuma Sambudla, Chair. Those are the ones I've received at the moment, Chair. I will communicate if I receive any further apologies.
Okay. If there's any members who are joining in between after we must not disturb the presentation. We will then introduce them after the presentation. Can I now hand over to
Chair,
the leader?
just move in a second, Chair. Mr. Kigaba has raised his hand, Chair.
Mr. Kigaba?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I want to request to be excused at 12, Chairperson. But that having been said, I move for the adoption of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Seconders. A seconder for the meeting.
So, Chair, Mr. Chan speaking. I'll second it.
Thank you very much. I will now request the leader of the delegation to firstly introduce the delegation, and then we will allocate you almost an hour to present, and then we'll use the other hour to thoroughly engage, and then we'll then come up with a way forward from there. And then I would want to suggest that because we are either in our offices or home, a member can just quickly call for coffee or just prepare coffee while the meeting is in session, so that we make sure that we finish at least later between 12 and 12. Over to you of the delegation.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair, and also good morning to all the Honorable Committee members. My name is Matsi Modise. I'm the chairperson of the South African Startup Act movement. I'm an entrepreneur in my own right, and also a citizen of the Republic that wants to be part of the solution and not the problem. Chair, today we have joining us members of the South African startup community. You know, these are some of the greatest minds in our country that are focused on high impact, high growth startups. It's a combination of entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, impact accelerators, incubators, policy and legal experts. And it includes, I would name a few of our members whom will also be presenting. So I'll start with Melvin Lubega, who's a co-founder of GoOne, Katlego Mapai, who's a co-founder of Yoko. I'm sure you've been doing some shopping at some point in your lives, and you've seen the gadgets that a lot of shops utilize. Yoko. So one of the co-founders is joining us. We have Cheslin Jacobs, Chief Commercial Officer of Time Bank. Velani Mboweni, who's the CEO of a high growth startup. Ali Amani from Wemba Windsor, Alison Collier, MD of Endeavour. We have Marie Wilke, policy expert, Bongu Kunene and Regina Berkman, who are part of the Simedisa team, which is an industry association for entrepreneurs. Chair, just a little bit of background. The number 10 for us is quite special. So in 10 years ago is when we started on this journey of progressing policy in South Africa for high impact, high growth startups. We identified the gaps, we identified the opportunities of building great South African startups that are going to scale beyond our borders. These are startups that are going to employ many South Africans and also contribute significantly towards our economy. And the irony of it all is that 10 years ago, we had our late comrade Praveen Gordhan support and endorse this initiative when he was still the finance minister. So he played his part, and may his soul rest in peace. We're quite happy and excited that we've had great leadership. And Chair, the reason why we are here today, I think it's important to put that forward as also that we have clarity as we go along, is that we would like to get the support and the endorsement of the DTIC in helping us progress policy for high impact, high growth startups in our country. We'll cover various things, so I'll give a little bit of context, definition of what we mean as to what we mean when we say startups, and also where we are in terms of progressing policy. We'll share some stories and case studies. We will do just an AU framework, unpack that, and then also speak to what is a Startup Act and why do we need it for our country. And then we'll also engage and deliberate on a Q&A. Chair, what do we mean by, you can go to the next slide. Chair, what do we mean when we say startups in our country? These are not the small corner cafes or the moms and pop shops. These are companies that are, established in South Africa, driven with high impact and high growth ambitions. These are mid-sized companies with earnings below 100 million in turnover. But these are companies that one day will be the discoveries of our country. These are companies that create and deploy high technology in their processes, companies that start with the aim of growing beyond the borders of our country. So they do want to scale beyond. And then these are also companies that do create intellectual property and invest in a lot of research and development. These countries have the ability and the propensity to employ South Africans. They have the propensity to contribute towards our economy. And in essence, we need more and more of such companies that will be able to contribute significantly. Chair, over the past 10 years, like I said, it's been quite a journey for us. Initially, we gathered ourselves as an ecosystem of support, right? Whether it's the entrepreneurs, the incubators, accelerators, the venture capitalists who are early stage investors. And we've been able to identify ourselves as who we are, but then also identify what are the gaps, what are the opportunities, and what are the challenges. And then at some point, about 4 years ago, we are now, instead of huddling amongst ourselves and complaining amongst ourselves, we're able to engage government. So we had a great meeting with the president, and he was quite clear that South Africa has to be more entrepreneurial if we are going to drive growth and change in our country. And he referred to South Africa being a startup nation of sorts. And so since then, we were able then to have access with people that have the ability to change policy. So we've engaged with a Department of Science and Innovation. We've engaged with the Department of Small Business Development, and various other, and I think also the ministry, the Minister of Finance, our current Minister of Finance. So we've been able to engage with government, but where we are now is we do need to now put in place policies that will support us, right? We've been talking about it. It's been 10 years, and now it's that inflection point of how then do we ensure that we progress these policies, which of course my colleagues will speak more to as to the what, the why, and also the business case. I'm going to now hand it over to a few of our great South African minds, great South African entrepreneurs that will be able to share their journeys, that will be able to share their great stories, and then also share what is it that we need from our government? How can you support us? Because it's a collective effort. Chair, thank you very much. I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll hand it over to Melvin Lubega, who's the co-founder of Go One. Over to you, Melvin.
No, thank you very much, Matsi. Chair, honorable members, thank you for this opportunity. I think similar to Matsi, I'm one of those South Africans that's trying to be part of the solution and not the problem. Ultimately, my goal across my career is to get 100,000 jobs, and so we've got a long way to go in achieving that. I really would like to share today some lessons from my first business, Go One, which I built. And to give you context, what Go One is a Spotify for corporate learning. So we ultimately exist to help people unlock their potential through a love for learning. And our key goal is to make people more employable or gain skills that allow them to be more economically productive. So we began Go One 9 years ago. And over the last 9 years, I guess we began from friends sitting in a kitchen/office in one of our homes to now having a team of over 700 employees, ultimately building towards that particular vision on our journey. And when we think about, what really drives us is the metrics we have in our business in terms of impact. And so what we're proud today is that every 3 seconds, someone completes a course on our platform or upskills themselves in a particular way, which allows them to be more economically productive and more employable. So when you think about youth unemployment, the reality is that there's a strong burden on how do people get skills to be able to upskill themselves. And so from that perspective, we've impacted over 50 million learners on that journey. But even beyond that, we're actually able to work with over 200 SME content providers. So we don't create any content ourselves. We actually have SMEs that actually generate that content for us to enable us to deliver that through our platform to our organizations actually around the world. And so we have clients in over 60 countries in achieving that. One of our proudest client moments, often in tech, we say that, we're in the cloud, we're omnipresent. But for us, it's been partnering with SALGA, South African Local Government Association, particularly beginning post-COVID, to help train all the new councillors and really putting to the test whether you can access the system in every single ward in South Africa. And we're proud to have partnered with them over the last 4 years on that particular journey. I think reflecting on our business journey and really just to, distill, call it 3, I think 1, lessons and experience from our journey, which if a startup act was in place, would have enabled us to 1, grow larger, have a bigger impact, and more importantly, have an even larger impact in South Africa. On our journey in building Go One, we've raised over $450 million, most of which has come from international investors, from the likes of Microsoft, Salesforce, SoftBank, tier 1 investors globally. And what you realize in that journey is that, a venture capital investor isn't necessarily forced to invest in a particular country, continent, or company. And so we're competing in a global market, not only for skills, but also for capital. And in that particular way, very early on in our journey, what was clear for many of the investors was, it was difficult for them to put money into South Africa, given some of the regulations and exchange control rules that we'll be speaking about shortly. And that actually hindered our growth almost to the point where we had a near-death experience within our organization. And today we've grown, from 0 to over 5 billion rand in revenue. But the reality is, especially in 2 of our fundraisers, where that was a particular issue with some of the international investors who ultimately are fueling the innovation that we're trying to do. But I think where governments have also seen come to the fore on our journey has been interesting. So in our first round, in our seed round, so my co-founder was my classmate. So I studied at UCT. I'm an actuary by training, but I did my postgraduate studies at the University of Oxford. And one of my classmates was from Australia, who's a co-founder of mine in the business. And because he was Australian, we were able to get the Australian government to actually come alongside us in one of our earlier rounds. And I think we can go into the detail there. What they did quite nicely was they said, we'll invest a third of the round, then must have been about 10 million Rand equivalent. And they said they'll do so under the condition that other capital that came in from private individuals will then have the ability to buy them out over a 10-year period at a interest rate accruing over a period of time. And what that actually meant was we were able to attract tier 1 investors to invest in our business. And there was also then a commitment for us to still have a presence in Australia. And that actually catalyzed our growth. Then from, at that point in time, we probably had only $1 million worth of revenue in our business. And I think that's the role in which we saw in our example, how government was able to catalyze that. But I think finally, from my example, I think more importantly, has been the challenge of getting skills required. I think we're building global businesses that are ultimately trying to innovate, create jobs, solve meaningful problems. And the biggest challenge was trying to get some of my senior employees to actually come and work with the teams in South Africa. And so incredibly sharp developer and IT lead who was based in Vietnam, and we struggled for months to try and get him to actually be able to even just spend time and work with the teams in South Africa. Unfortunately, in the end, he actually was never able to come, and so he actually ended up building a team around him in Vietnam. And again, whilst we still have a strong client base and impact in South Africa, I think those are opportunities that could have been enabled us to, one, double down on creating jobs in South Africa even more so, and 2, have an impact, particularly in the product that we offer. I mean, I understand that from when we're building now to today, there have been changes, but the reality is the hope is that through some of the initiatives we're going to address in the Startup Act, we'll address that. Today, I'm hoping to replicate that success with Go1 in the logistics space in South Africa, and we already have 100 employees. And so we're building from South Africa again, and there's no doubt that some of these interventions will help us on that journey. And so thank you for the opportunity, and also happy to deep dive into any points I've mentioned. And I'll also hand over to my fellow colleague in arms. I don't know who's next after me. Chisholm.
Perfect. Thanks, Malvin. Thanks, Mansi, and good morning to all the members. So yeah, so very similar to Malvin. Some of our stories most probably have a lot more in common. So I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at TimeBank, but also one of the founding members of the business that we started just over 12 years ago. We were approximately 17 people on day one and have subsequently grown this business to over 3,500 people worldwide. We've created over 6,000 jobs in the country. And of those 6,000 jobs, most probably 90% of them were for unemployed youth or previously unemployed youth that we consciously chose to give their very first opportunity. But I think the important thing to mention is what gives rise to businesses like ours. I think in a country like ours is the reality that South Africa still faces many, many problems. And I think the lens you have to place over these problems is the reality that what problems present are opportunities. And the best people to take advantage of opportunities are often business. But the environment has to support and enable that business to capitalize on those opportunities. So the opportunity we saw in South Africa is obviously we operate in financial services, a highly, highly regulated industry. However, for the longest time, for all intents and purposes, the industry was oligopolistic, where there was a few really, really big players and essentially controlled the entire market. And essentially what that does is limits choice to your end user. And the minute the end user has limited choice, they've got very limited ability to influence the products and services that get offered to them. However, TimeBank was the first bank to get a license in South Africa in over 20 years. Now, again, you look at the number of retail banks we have in South Africa versus the population size, and you look at very similar markets around the world. Markets that have smaller populations have multiples of the number of retail banks we have. And obviously what that does is will facilitate competition. And when competition is rife, the only beneficiary is the end user. So it's important that these environments, at least that our environment, gives rise to new businesses, not prohibited. And very similarly to Melvin and his business, some of the biggest challenges we faced was raising capital. Even though we've raised lots of capital, we've also lost opportunity to raise lots of capital. Our most recent call it lost opportunity from a capital perspective is one of the leading investment banks in the world. Investment committee had approved $100 million investment into the business. And at the very last stage, the compliance team of this investment bank turned back on the decision as a result of the operating environment we found ourselves in. So one of the big things they listed as a reason why they can't proceed with the investment is exchange control. And the ability to get skills, the right skills into the country to help the business grow. But why these things are important is that even though our business has grown, in about 5 or 6 days' time, we'll hit 10 million customers in just over 5 years. So one of the fastest growing digital banks in the world, and definitely the fastest growing bank in South Africa. But the reality is, for us to accelerate any of that growth, you need capital. Because what that capital allows you to do is to invest in things in your business you know is working, and allows you to scale and accelerate those things a lot faster. And arguably that's probably been our toughest challenge to date, is to raise capital in the way that makes a lot of sense for the investors. But a lot of that has been based around how our exchange control laws are structured. And we therefore then have to complicate our organizational structures to allow this money to flow into our business. But in the meantime, what you actually end up doing is enriching law firms because they spend a lot of time architecting what your structures look like for these investments to flow. So on the job side of business like ours, again, in the way that we've scaled this business, over 6,000 jobs created. Like I said, 90% of them for unemployed youth. More than 60% of those unemployed youth were female. And in 95% of our cases, we've hyper-localized recruitment. And what we mean by that is what we've enabled is our employees to take no more than one taxi to get to their working place. But essentially what that allows us to do is to invest back in the communities we've chosen to do business in. But again, by having a framework or by having an environment that allows for capital to flow into the country a lot easier, a lot simpler, that makes a lot of sense for these investors. Businesses like ours, I think, can thrive. Businesses like Melvin's can thrive. And because South Africa presents so much opportunity, I think an environment that allows for these things will allow us to unearth all of this and in essence create lots and lots of jobs for lots and lots of young people. Thank you, Matsi. I'll hand over to Katleb.
Thank you, Chisholm. That was great to hear from you. Good morning to everyone. Really pleased to be here and to spend the time. So my name is Katla Homapai. I'm co-founder and CEO of Yoko. We founded this company back in 2013. We're 4 co-founders of the business. And really, we came from the telecoms industry where it was really easy to get a mobile phone. And we looked at what was happening with card payments in South Africa. And at the time, there were only 250,000 merchants out of, let's say, about 5 million businesses. Yet, 7 out of 10 consumers had a card in their pocket. So we couldn't make sense of that gap. It was a gap we hadn't seen anywhere else in the world. And when we took a look at it, we found that the banks were just making it extremely difficult to get a machine. So you had to take out a 24-month contract. You had to rent the machine for 500 rands before you even did a transaction. You had to be in a central area so a salesperson could come see you. You had to be able to be of a certain size. You had to commit to minimum volumes, etc., etc. Just this all laundry list. And the reality is, when you think of an economy, it's a sum of transactions, and every single transaction involves a payment. So really a payment is the base of an economy, and when these payments are not digitized, then you can argue that people are not formally participating in the economy. So this is really what we wanted to solve at a fundamental level. And we just found that the incentives for the incumbent institutions were not there to do it. And so we literally had to spend first year convincing one of the banks to share their license with us. That was a 1-year process. And eventually we got there, and coming out of that really made it as simple as possible to get a machine. We innovated in distribution by creating a context where you could go online, see one of our ads on Facebook where we were telling you that you could actually get a machine and you didn't have to go to a bank. You would go to our website, sign up in 5 minutes. We would vet you, and within 48 hours ship you a machine to anywhere in the country, and you could start transacting on the day. And that's really what you've seen in our model, and sort of the presence of our machines and the wide reach, is that we just removed all the barriers to getting a machine, and we sort of took it away from being a privilege to just being an ordinary tool that anyone who wants to get it should have access. So we've now serving over 200,000 businesses in the country, processing about 50 billion rands. I think what we're most proud of is those 200,000 businesses, 80% of them taking card payments through us for the first time. So that's been the main KPI in the business that we've been tracking. We're trying to build a market, we're trying to create access, and this is very important for us. In addition to that, half of our base is female, and a third of our base is outside of the urban centers. So really have proven that there was an inherent need in the market. The incumbents were not able to attend to it. We had to fight to have an opportunity to solve this problem. And eventually, once we were able to do that, we were able to kind of get to these customers in a manner that wasn't done before. Now, that's the top line story. It has been challenging at every step of the way. Spending a year having to convince an institution to share their license with us versus having a framework where we can engage directly with the regulator, that would have been ideal and could have potentially gone a bit faster. In terms of fundraising, we've raised $150 million, and most of it has been FDI. And I remember when we did our first institutional round in 2017, really convincing two foreign fintech funds to do their first investments into South Africa, which was really difficult. And we really had to be operating at a level to prove that. And then, during the closing process, we needed to get sign off from the SARB that the funds could be repatriated at some point in the event of an exit. And that was a multi-month process. And we actually had a cash crunch during that period and had to do all sorts of things just to keep going. So yeah, you're doing all this hard work, you're raising this capital, you're convincing, and then now you're dealing with these challenges, which you really don't need. And we just want to be out there helping, supporting small businesses and not dealing with these challenges. And yeah, one of the conditions, because of what happened, was we were expected to externalize our holding structure. Actually, Alia helped us with that process, which was very important. And we had to create a holding structure in Mauritius with a subsidiary in South Africa. And that has subsequently made our capital raising process a lot easier and a lot cleaner. But this was, took us over the 12 to 18-month process. We prefer to have we would have preferred not to have to do that. When you think about it, it's actually very unnecessary. But we had to, and this has kind of facilitated our ability to raise capital in a very clean way going forward. There's a couple of things I really want to touch on that I think is really fundamental from a policy perspective that really needs to be addressed. So I've touched on the capital controls and really opening up the flow of capital in and out of the country. I still find that we're in a bit of a almost a sanctions orientation when it comes to this stuff, and I really believe we underestimate the impact, decades of sanctions and how that's, formed business culture in the country and oligopoly and concentration and even just the role of regulation. We really need to unpack this and come to terms with it, because we've almost just been continuing in a straight line and not really taking a fundamental reorientation around how do we really unlock growth. And you can't grow without opening things up. You won't create competition, you won't create participation. All you're going to do is just continue to entrench what's been there. And then another dimension is on talent. So, business like ours, we're building payment systems, we're dealing with hardware, we're dealing with risk management, building software. It's a highly technical and highly skilled environment, and we need access to the best skills in the world. And right now, it is very difficult to get work visas. Even though people want to move to the country and highly skilled folks, it's really, really difficult. And we've had to go to the extreme lengths of setting up a talent hub in the Netherlands, where we are able to now hire highly skilled talent who would have gladly have moved to South Africa, but just couldn't. So that's just another expense, something we should not have to be doing, but very, very much necessary for being able to move our company forward. And then the final point I want to make is around just regulation. Back to my point around the sanctions, I really do see an environment where it almost seems like the role of regulation is to protect the industry and the companies that sit inside of it, which once again makes a ton of sense when you're a closed economy. But when you're in an open economy, really regulation is about protecting consumers and fostering competition. And I really think this is a critical topic that we need to address. And ultimately, if you think about it, it's new ventures, these new businesses, we're at the forefront of trying to move things forward. And we'd really love to see a more of an enabling environment that can make that happen. So thank you very much, and I hope this has been useful.
Thank you, Katlego. It's my pleasure to now take this conversation from these really inspiring startup conversations into the more technical policy space. Honorable delegates, it's my pleasure to be addressing you this morning. Thank you. I'm going to speak specifically about the process in the African Union, and allow me to just give you some historical background first. In March 2023, the heads of state and government of African Union member states during the summit mandated the African Union Commission to develop a startup model law and a policy framework. And it was my honor, together with my team at Africa Practice, we are a Pan-African policy consulting firm and a startup in our own right, to develop these documents for the African Union and to oversee a very significant stakeholder engagement process that led us to the consideration of the final documents in May this year by the Special Technical Committee on Trade by the African Union, and finally the adoption of the African Union Startup Model Law and Policy Framework by the Council of Ministers in Trade in July of this year. So why did the AU Summit mandate this process to begin with? You can see on the slides there are three key considerations that the AU considered. The first is that they directly contribute to our economy through tax, GDP contribution, as well as employment. Just over $5 billion in venture capital funding, for instance, was raised by 5,200 African startups in 2022. This was a significant increase of 55% from the previous year. In the same year, 633 startups on the continent employed over 34,000 people, which is an average of 54 people per startup. Second, startups really is where innovation happens. And I think we just heard that with 3 really inspiring stories. It's any of the considerations that we just heard, but it can also speak directly to some of the challenges that we experience as the continent. For instance, we have startups on the continent that invest in genomics research to ensure that genomics represent the most diverse area in the world, which is our continent. We have startups that are investing in agri-tech to ensure that food security solutions are found. And of course, we have a significant amount of innovation happening in the new and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence used for e-commerce and many other applications. So these startups collectively really critically contribute to our innovation, and thereby they find solutions that address the unique challenges that we have. And then thirdly, many startups focus on advanced technologies such as cloud and AI, and in so doing, they enable the growth of many other industries on the continent. I'd like to give you one more statistic here. A recent study has found that AI applications could support up to $139 billion worth of economic benefits in 2030 in 3 African nations alone, one of them being South Africa. In the current context of the economic environment globally, startup legislation matters more than ever before. And we have just heard from 3 startup founders as to some of the specific considerations in South Africa. The AU-wide approach, however, specifically matters because it has the potential to create a harmonized marketplace. And we can see that the economic downturn in 2023, for instance, meant that startups on the continent struggled not only with reduced funding being available globally, but also with skyrocketing operating costs, as well as reduced customer base and more difficult customer acquisition. A harmonized and aligned continental market can address the last challenge in particular. And I know that we have often discussed this in this forum, as well as in other forums concerning regional trade and the AFCFTA. Secondly, it matters because we have the unique opportunity to create a truly innovative and groundbreaking regulatory framework for advanced technologies in Africa, and that includes cloud computing, that includes other computational innovation, as well as artificial intelligence. And in this context, it's really important to note that Africa is trying to be a first mover in that space at the moment, and so is South Africa. And we can see that these signals to investors are incredibly important alongside the actually enabling regulatory framework. So with these considerations in mind, the AU embarked on developing the model law, and it is based on the considerations from existing startup acts across Africa. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in developing the startup model law for the African Union and with the African Union, we consider the policy frameworks and existing startup acts in a number of African countries. You can see a timeline on the screen, and I know this has been submitted to you as part of the reading pack as well. Most African countries which have advanced and maintained or cultivated the growth trajectories of their startup ecosystems have made significant progress with regards to dedicated startup legislation. That means that either an act is enforced or a significantly advanced draft has been considered and advanced. Countries where acts have been adopted, and I'm speaking specifically about acts here as opposed to solely amendments to existing laws, have seen the greatest return of investment. An OECD evaluation of the impact of Italy's Startup Act, and I'm quoting Italy because it was the first global Startup Act globally, revealed that the country saw a positive cost-benefit balance after only 6 years of passing the act, despite significant tax incentives as part of the regime. During the same period, registered startups were found to have increased their revenue, assets, and value add by margins of between 10 and 25% when compared to counterparts who could not benefit from the act. And we now have similar data for Tunisia, which in 2018 was the first African nation to adopt the Startup Act. Moreover, data by the African Union predicts that Africa's startup sector could double in size in the coming 2 decades if the model law is implemented by all member states, first and foremost, those that already harbor a sizable startup as well as technology scene, and this is of course led by South Africa. If we go to the next slide, I will briefly walk you through some of the key components in Startup Acts. These are all considered in detail in the AU model law as well as the policy framework. When it comes to startups, no startup law globally has opted to put down a strict definition. Instead, they all opt to what is called label a startup by referring to a series of criteria. These may include incorporation type, for instance, or age. They can also refer to a label duration, staff strength, turnover, ownership. And it is really important to consider this approach to labeling in the context of the wider startup law structure. For instance, if you choose to provide for corporate income tax benefits or a reduction thereof, a short label duration of less than 5 years may not make sense, as most startups don't make a profit within the first 5 years. If your industry has a really strong growth potential in the agri-tech space, you may not want to include a staff strength criteria, as these businesses tend to have a much higher headcount than other startups. So these options are discussed and outlined in further detail in the policy framework and are important to be considered in the context of the nation's startup ecosystem. But staying on the subject of tax incentives, these can be a critical lever for startups, especially in their very early days. And this is particularly true for R&D related expenses, so that they can continue to invest in R&D, which ultimately is the most critical asset of startups. And a really good option for governments here are tax credits that can be offset against other tax. It can also be beneficial to consider tax credits that can incentivize investment by startup founders, for instance, by introducing tax rebates for personal investments, stock options, capital gains for directors and employees, and similar options. And then as stated, the specific design, again, must interact with the chosen labeling approach in order for it to be effective. The third key regulatory enablement is a conducive intellectual property system. And that's just purely because intellectual property is startups' most valuable asset at the end of the day. And in the context of advanced technologies, the protection of source code deserves very specific mention. One-stop shops and accelerated timelines are important options for member states to consider as well. And in this context, member states may consider providing template contracts for free for startups, for instance, which could regulate the contractual license rights between employees and businesses from the get-go as it relates to intellectual property. Alternatively, they can also consider stipulating for automatic assignment under labor laws, for instance, and this is particularly relevant in the context of source code protection. Again, these and other options are outlined in detail in the policy framework. And then last but not least, given AI's emerging adoption and its potential contribution to the African economy, thoughtful AI regulation is key to realize the potential economic and technological gains. For startups specifically, additional collective member state action around real-world testing environments will be important, and this is an action that following the adoption, the African Union has resolved to continue working towards. This would allow them to compete with global tech companies, for instance. And then we have already heard that a really important component here is to consider the available skills on the continent and to facilitate skills availability, which does include conducive visa regimes, of course, as well as conducive labor regimes that facilitate the specific contractual arrangements. And then last but not least, of course, alignment on the wider startup and innovation ecosystem, and that includes culture, education approaches, so really building thriving entrepreneurial spirits across the ecosystem are important, and that speaks to innovation and encouragement. Now, the African Union has spelled out the roadmap for implementation as part of the policy framework. It has 3 different pillars or components at national level, at member state level. And the first is that the African Union recommends that regional economic communities, and I know that SADC earlier this week in South Africa, in Cape Town, in fact, just had the Southern African Conference on Startup Regulation. So regional economic communities have an important role to play, regional organizations do as well, but then most crucially, of course, member states. And for them, the first task is to conduct preliminary gap assessments of the existing legislative and regulatory legal framework as it applies to our startups, using the model law as a benchmark. Second, the roadmap must be developed to clearly stipulate the plan of action that needs to be undertaken based on the identified gaps. And this roadmap, together with the plans of action, then constitute a comprehensive and systematic approach to responding to the results of the gap assessment in the member states, and can then lead towards the ultimate implementation and ratification. And for this third pillar, really for legislators in particular, the most crucial step is to initiate startup build development processes and concurrently implement comprehensive programs with regards to the wider ecosystem and aligning the initiatives. But I cannot stress the importance really of focusing on startup builds and ultimately startup acts in a comprehensive manner that integrates the different components that I have just spoken to. I thank you for your attention, and I hand over to my colleagues who will now anchor this African Union outlook, specifically in the reality of South Africa's current legislative and regulatory framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie, and thank you, honourable members, for the opportunity. Just to give you some background on who I am, because it will give you a lens through which to receive some of this information. You mentioned, you would have heard from Katlego mentioned I was previously an attorney, but also I was an attorney who really struggled to say no to the most innovative businesses about what they could or couldn't do, and to say that they could not advance, they could not, manage through these regulatory hurdles without expensive attorneys like ourselves. And that was heartbreaking at the time. I then subsequently entered a tech startup to try and drive business growth, try to expand internationally, and then truly understood the burden that is imposed on startups in real life. And subsequently, I'm now running an incubation center and startup, and really experience these things both as a lawyer, both as someone interested in policy, and as an entrepreneur. And so trying to pull everything together, you would have heard, the reasons for startup legislation from Marie, but importantly, you would have heard the real life stories on the ground from our entrepreneurs. And so to anchor everything and to bring it all together, maybe let's zoom out again and remind ourselves and emphasize what we're asking for and what the problem is and why we're concerned. The overarching issue is that South Africa has become simply a less attractive jurisdiction for entrepreneurs, for investors, compared to our counterparts abroad. And it is simply onerous for South Africans to do business compared to other countries in the world. This is reflected very objectively in the significant drop by South Africa in the World Bank Ease of Business rankings. You would have heard about our fragmented policies and complex regulations from the entrepreneurs this morning, and the resulting impact on limited access to finance, and the restricted ability to expand globally, the shortage of skilled talent in our country that's made worse by the reality of entrepreneurs being forced to leave to pursue growth and sometimes even survival. And the impact, unfortunately, is significantly fewer successful startups in South Africa than there could be, much lower job creation, much lower and much needed investment into South Africa, limited skills transfer for our people, inhibited innovation, intellectual property, and technology development, and ultimately, much lower economic growth and transformation in our country. And so we have some priority proposals that we will talk through today. And of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. But essentially, we're going to draw your attention to 4 key proposals today. The first is that we need appropriate startup-specific laws, which will include some guardrails to identify or label the qualifying startups that should benefit from an improved dispensation. We believe it's important to modernize exchange controls, remove the inhibiting regulatory barriers that hamper globalization and investment into qualifying startups. It's critical that we enable the attraction and retention of highly skilled talent, including foreign talent, in the form of special startup visas. And finally, as you would have heard from Marie and others, tax incentives are a good idea if you'd like to encourage investment in startups and ultimately reduce their setup costs. So let's dive into a little bit more on the detail of the proposals. The first proposal is on exchange control modernization. And what are we asking for? We're suggesting more conducive and appropriate regulations that align with the reality on the ground, the business activity of startups. We think it's important to reduce the inhibiting impact of exchange control regulations that restrict how businesses are run, how they can invest in innovation, and how they can attract financial capital. And we believe that we need to streamline exchange control administrative processes to enable greater certainty, shorter lead times, and lower the overhead. Why do we need to do this? And to emphasize the points that have already been made, we need to significantly increase access to capital for startups. We need to enable, not restrict, global business expansion and investment into IP. We need to reduce the compliance and operational overhead to free up resources that are already quite limited, which can then instead be channeled towards employment opportunities, customer acquisition, and fundraising. And hopefully all of this, we think, will lead to higher job creation and taxable revenue for South Africa. How can this be implemented? The first proposal in this regard is to mitigate risk for South Africa. And we believe that we can create criteria to define or label the startups that can qualify for this dispensation, to create the guardrails that you might otherwise need from a policy perspective. So, guardrails and objective factors which talk to perhaps the stage of the business, but maybe especially including an R&D or operational entity through which South Africans will be employed. That should create the foundation to give our policymakers sufficient comfort, we believe. The second key proposal is process modernization. As it stands, businesses need to go through an extremely complex and long process to get prior approval before implementing any transactions. Given the mechanisms that can be created to create or limit risk, we believe that prior approval should not be required, and instead an expedited process through which transactions that meet the stated criteria can be reported is a much faster, much certain, and simpler process that will lead to shorter lead times and enable the startups to get much needed funding and enable them to commercialize their IP. We think we need to align with best practice in terms of what we expect our startups to do in terms of their corporate structures. So we're talking vanilla shareholding structures that are common everywhere else in the world, and that are permissible in those jurisdictions, and ensure that our startups are not penalized simply because of a technical corporate reason that results in them falling out of most investment mandates throughout the world and impact access to foreign direct investment. And then importantly, given that IP is so key to any business, we need to provide qualifying startups with the freedom to commercialize, transact, do business with their intellectual property and in their innovations in the best interests of their businesses. Our second proposal is essentially around access to skills. How we do this is through special startup visas. We believe that underpinning all of this, we need to enable better access to top global talent and scarce skills, as this is essential for local skills transfer and the growth and success of startups. Automatic and fast-track visa approvals should be allowed for foreign skilled employees where the startups require these skills to scale and grow their businesses. And of course, where this will enable skills transfer and training of our people locally, especially in environments where skills are scarce. Part of this should include more appropriate terms, including visa duration for these foreign highly skilled professionals who are willing to contribute to the startups, to the people they employ, and ultimately our economy. The third overarching proposal is around tax incentives. Our view and our proposal is that South Africa needs to create a set of tax incentives to stimulate access to capital for qualifying startups. This could be done by encouraging third-party investments, simplifying tax registrations, and enabling reinvestment. The benefits, as you might expect, include attracting more investors, unlocking diverse funding sources, and providing qualifying startups with resources to develop and scale. Enabling qualifying startups to overcome financial hurdles, reach key business milestones faster, and ultimately achieve sustainable growth. Why? Because financial capital is the lifeblood of startups. It fuels innovation, growth, job creation, and ultimately highable taxable income within South Africa. We must significantly increase access to financial capital and need to create mechanisms for doing that. Two potential ways of doing that is by encouraging third-party investment, introducing incentives to encourage capital contributions to early-stage funding entities by VCs, venture capital investors, and that will enable investment into qualifying startups.
Sorry, just one second. Zelda, can you please switch off your mic, please? You can proceed.
Thank you. Ultimately, encouraging third-party investment will increase the availability of capital, but critically also enable access to the skills and networks of those venture capital organizations. Secondly, simplifying tax registrations and offering tax incentives in early years. We'd like to propose simplifying the registration for and administration of PAYE and VAT for qualifying startups and enabling them or allowing them to reinvest those taxes into the growth of their businesses. This will increase available capital for job creation and growth, but very importantly, also reduce administrative burdens, allowing these amazing entrepreneurs to focus their financial and operational resources on what matters most: growing revenue, innovating, and creating jobs. Where do we get these views from? And we can go into detail or send you the underlying reports separately as well. But having done some analysis of the data from research and surveys that have been conducted by the South African Venture Capital Organization and others, a 5-year outlook of the impact of a thriving SME sector suggests that more than 1 million jobs could be created. 80% of Black youth could be positively impacted by these job opportunities. And this is to counterbalance with the reality of today, which is where 200,000 high-growth entrepreneurial jobs are actually lost each year to the offshore market. Getting this right could add 910 billion rand to GDP over a 5-year period, 175 billion of which would come from high-growth South African entrepreneurs. 450 billion rand in foreign capital could be raised, 90 billion of which will be raised by South African businesses at a minimum. A sample set of 30 high-growth SMEs a few years ago showed us that the average revenue was 233 million rand per business, a total of 6 billion just among 30. Almost 6,000 jobs created over a 4-year period by just this city, and an average headcount in 2021 of 450 per business, with a diversity of over 75%, only among 30. The VC market has grown. Nigeria, as you can see, is growing faster, but there's significant upside in FDI potential for South Africa. And you'll see there in the World Bank Ease of Business rankings, we were doing well in 2008. We need to get there. We've now fallen back, and South African is now below the top 50 in the same period within which Nigeria has moved up 20 spots. We think we can do better and should do better when it comes to ease of business. What is the case for change? We believe that we need to unlock entrepreneurship and economic growth. And we do this by exempting qualifying startups from inhibiting regulations, bureaucratic practices, and complexity. We need to give entrepreneurs more resources and time to focus on what matters most: business growth, innovation, and job creation. We need to align South Africa to global best practice and make it a more attractive and competitive jurisdiction for business. We need to enable meaningful access to global and local market opportunities, driving economic development and higher tax and revenue potential. And we need to attract foreign capital and skills to ignite our economy, develop our people, and accelerate innovation. And so our recommendation is to exempt qualifying startups from inhibiting regulations and practices, create more efficient and appropriate processes to increase clarity and reduce complexity, engage with the ecosystem to find real-world solutions that enable economic transformation. And this requires a revisiting of existing laws to understand the unintended impact on our economy and the employment rates. Ultimately, our ask is for you to sponsor the development of a South African Startup Act. With that in mind, that is the end of our presentation, but of course we can move at the appropriate time to questions and answers. Thank you. Honourable Chair, over to you.
So is it back to us now?
We went a little bit faster than we intended, but hopefully that means a bit more time for questions or any thoughts from committee members.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for the very detailed presentation. I will now allow members through a show of hand. Andrew, you'll help me if I can't see them. I see Member Chance.
Mr. Chance, Chair?
Yes, I can see him.
Dr. Ndlozi.
Dr. Ndlozi. And then can I see all the hands so that we take the round once or twice? Okay, let's just those two for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Hope you can all hear me. And yeah, again, thank you, Chair, for putting this on the agenda of the committee this term. Appreciate it very much. And it's so good to see so many people on the meeting, including some journalists, including Advocate Voller from the CIPC, and many other people. So first of all, thanks to the presenters for this phenomenal overview. And I should just make the point that I'm not going to spend time going over everything that's already been said. I have had the privilege of knowing many of these people for some time, dating back to 2014 when the startup movement was launched. And in fact, it's almost a case study of how it's difficult to get a startup off the ground in this country on its own because of the regulatory hurdles they themselves have had to try and overcome in dealing with the Byzantine government that we have, wading through many departments, finance, science, technology, innovation, small business development, and home affairs, and so on. And I think that what we have presented with today is a fantastic opportunity, particularly because we have the benefit of many African countries having already gone down this path, and the AU framework has provided a phenomenal blueprint to allow us to fast track this process in South Africa. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to then look at, if we are going to take this forward, the best possible mechanisms for that to happen. And I'm also happy to see that Advocate Van der Merwe is also on the call from the parliamentary legislative drafting section, because this does present complex drafting challenges because of the cross-departmental nature of this bill, if it is going to become a bill, dealing with finance, home affairs, regulations, and so on. So I really that's all I really have to say at this point, Chair. But just to say, I think that there's an opportunity for this department and for this committee to use this as an example of real intervention in the economy. I think it's quite clear from all the contributions made by committee members over the last couple of months that the DTIC should be driving economic policy in this country, and this is one way in which we can do that by helping to get this Startup Act over the line. Thank you very much. I don't actually have any questions because, as I said, I've been dealing with these people for a while, and I've had the privilege of having insights from them for some time. I'm very keen to hear what the other members of the committee say. Thank you.
Dr. Ndlozi?
Thank you, Chairperson, and good morning to everybody. Indeed, we welcome the presentation and the stories that have been shared by some of the entrepreneurs. I think that generally in this country, first of all, there still has to be a lot of public awareness work done on a startup, on the concept of a startup, and in a much more specific way. Because when you say you are running for instance, 5 billion rand business, 50 billion rand revenue business, very few people will appreciate and think of that as a small business. Because I think in general in the country, there is very little appreciation of the numbers. Even if you say, this is how I started, I'm at 50 now, but if you're part of a conversation of startups, so it seems to me that there has to still be a lot of much more public-driven education on the contours of a startup business. And I understand that it's part of what the presentation persuades us to have to do, particularly with regards to the legislation. If an act were to be written, would have to take a decision on that type of a question. But I think generally, even when you say my business is worth 200 million rands, it's very difficult to win the public opinion in that sense. So maybe I would like the panelists or the presenters to their reaction to that in the context of South Africa. What would the limits be? The category of a startup, so to speak. What numbers would you put to it in South African rands? A couple of years ago, President Ramaphosa had committed to establishing what he called a red tape unit. If I'm not mistaken, it was supposed to be dealing with easing the bureaucratic, legislative and regulatory requirements, particularly for small businesses. I'm asking if for this movement, if you've had any interaction with that unit, if it has been in any way helpful. And maybe part of what we may have to do, or comrades of the committee, is get some review, some report, invite them to the committee to say, what have you been doing as a unit? Have you really been easing the business, the bureaucratic weight of doing business in South Africa? But I'd like to hear from the panelists if you've had any interaction with that red tape unit and if it has been in any way helpful. Chairperson, I'm also interested to know if, in addition, because I don't remember the slide number, some of the things that they were highlighting as instruments that may help startups in South Africa, tax incentives, doing away with the red tape and so on and so forth.
Is it floor?
Sounds to me.
Okay, you're going to do that quick.
Andre, please switch off your mic. Apologies, Dr. Ndlozi, if you can proceed.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thanks. So, I want to understand, would a special economic zone for startups assist if we were to establish a special economic zone for startups? Because the things seems to me that you are looking for are things that are attained in special economic zones: tax incentives, subsidies, all types of administrative help for foreign companies to come and operate. And there are a lot of things that are uplifted in the special economic zones. Would a special economic zone, of course, in addition to this act that you're looking for, but acts are something else. Would a special economic zone, that if you are a startup and you're operating in this zone, be a solution? But also, I mean, I know we think of a special economic zone as a physical geographic area, but you could imagine a virtual special economic zone where you create a virtual instrument and say the following subscribers in this platform are operating under these conditions of a special economic zone. But the concept of a special economic zone in South Africa, it seems to me to be trying to achieve these things that are a problem to you. And then my final 2 points, I want to make the political point late as the concluding one. So my penultimate point is access to capital. What forms, for us here in Parliament, we always hear massive stories of billions and billions and hundreds of millions of rands spent to help small businesses. I thought one of the things that are going to be said from yourselves is, we received this much from IDC, or we received this much from National Empowerment Fund or some state entity before I go to private capital and foreign direct investment. We always get so much of reports that there is a lot of capital that is being given to, they call it small, medium enterprises, but, has there been any benefit, and could you quantify it? Are your people, meaning the people in your movement, receiving money from IDC? Are they receiving money from NEF? Are they receiving money from many of the DTIC companies that are supposed to assist with business funding, but also a PIC is the PIC in this space of startups. I know that pension funds, I'm not convinced. I mean, you might want to weigh in about pension funds investments being driven to venture capitalism. I mean, often you want to use the workers' money to much more established. But there is a conversation within this government, started in the main by the current trio in the ministry, the minister and his two deputies, about opening up not just PIC but all types of pension funds to fund venture capitalists. What are your views? Is that not one of the big instruments? But if you could address us on the help that you receive, so we know if we need to push in doing our oversight work for funding towards that particular direction. But as I said, there's a lot of reports that you are actually receiving a lot of funding. I don't have I'm not in Parliament. Maybe in the second round, I will pull up some of those documents. The final point is the political one, the legacy of sanctions being blamed, that the business environment in South Africa for breaking concentration of capital, for breaking capital, there are so many legislative instruments. I'm not persuaded that, it's because of the sanctions environment in the 80s and the 70s, that because of that environment, I think that generally the South African government is too beholden to big capital. We call it white monopoly capital. And many people think when we say white monopoly capital, we mean every single white business. In the last session, Chance explained that how many of the middle businesses in South Africa, like small family businesses, white owned, but they are family based. They are not the big players. And that space is being painted, so to speak, with the same brush of the big boys, particularly in the financial sector. Actually, most sectors in South Africa, that concentration, when we say white monopoly capital, we mean that, the oligopolies in this country. I'm saying that it has nothing to do with the environment of sanctions or anything. It's because the political actors in this country are beholden. You must go look at who funds elections, who funds even the internal ANC conferences, Mzwandile, without you comrades being provoked. But if you go check at the profile of the CR17 campaign money people, it's the big boys.
Dr. Ndlozi, can we keep it in the...
I'm done. Okay. I'm almost finished. I mean, I'm just saying that I think if your approach as well is some blaming of apartheid. I know how to blame apartheid. I can do it for you. But that legacy has to do with the big capital. The environment, the legislative environment favors the continuous concentration of South Africa's business in big capital because the political actors, by and large, are beholden to those people. That is my political challenge to that analysis, and thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ndlozi, for elaborate input, and we take away that which doesn't belong to the committee. Member Msezane, you'll be followed by Member Olga.
No, thanks, Chair. Thank you very much, colleagues, for the presentations. Well, the presentations look very enticing. particularly because they deal with aspects that seek to transform the society in job creation in particular. But perhaps from me, I might have captured the number of things wrong, so I'll seek just clarity. One, I on the presentations, there was a point that speaks to over 2,000 or over 200,000 South African SMEs being enabled through these startup companies. So I just want maybe more clarity on that. And about 2 billion capital dispersed to advanced SMBs. I did not really understand that one. And also the one that speaks to 50 billion payment already processed in South Africa. So from the presentations, I gathered that obviously there are certain things with regards to legislation that are required by the startup initiative or the startup act. But if there's these activities, for lack of a better word, that has been processed already, the presentation did not speak to the how part. How have these been achieved and how the objectives will be achieved through these startups? I would kindly request to be forgiven, but I'm a bit slow in terms of understanding these processes. So I'll seek more clarity on that one, Chairperson, from the presenters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Member Olga.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Morning, everyone. So mine is on, I think, 3 things, which also would need clarity. The first one being that I'm getting the sense that this startup bill is going to, in some sort of ways, temper with the current, legislations. For instance, it is saying that we have to have the visas made for the high-skilled workers or the experts that will be coming in to respond to the transfer of skills and to sort of have our people also skilled so that, but how is that going to work when we're not hearing details of that? We are already having a standing debate on our own immigrations and the acts and thereof. I'm also not sure how is that going to be digitalized. I'm hearing that there is a intention or efforts to digitalize that, which also would lead to another problem, I think, with regards to another labor relations complications with a problem. With regards to having the high-skilled workers coming in, would that not have to change also the minimum wage, which we already have set out as a legal standing, issue? Would that not also temper a bit? Then lastly, is the Reserve Bank involved here? Was there any consultation with them? And what has been updates or other developments in that issue? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. I see a hand. I was hoping that I will finish with the honorable members, but in the meantime, let me take Mani.
Thank you. We were going to respond maybe just to a couple of questions. It might facilitate the rest of the.
No. We still have
Okay.
more questions before, and then
Okay.
Mari is he also responding, because we'll give you a chance to respond.
Yes, we're both responding.
Okay, no, yeah, you can just take down your hands as soon as we are ready. Then we'll come back. So there are few things while other members maybe are still crafting their own questions on my part. I was just thinking, I had an opportunity at master's level to study entrepreneurship, innovation, and all the things that you were referring to. So in the context of what you are raising as a startup, I would effectively say this is a very good concept, but it's almost misleading because it's a startup that is very progressive. It's more like your big idea development for entrepreneurs, because so when we hear the word startup, we think about small business in South Africa. We think about the Small Business Act of 1996, and it prescribed even the numbers that some fellow members are asking, that the business between this range and that range, this range, I think it's about up to 100 million, if I still remember very well, having worked in the small business area. So just the name on its own in South Africa, you lose the essence of the context of the message that you are trying to deliver to us, because we hear you very well, that these are new innovators who are shooting from 1 to 1,000 in a short space of time, even if it means startup, existing, and. That is one. The second thing is that I think Dr. Andrews refers to this thing, that there has been initiative that would need to bring closer and examine dealing with red tape in South Africa, because, from your first interaction with CIPC, which is a central body that registers everybody, it should be easy for you, if you're in construction, to get a CIDB linkage there, to get a SARS for payee and VAT and other tax-related issues, to get your COIDA for the compensation of workers and all those things. But currently, you knock into so many doors, and I do believe that it's one area that we might need to examine in the context in South Africa and see how do we, as this group, enrich that process, so that because there is general acceptance that small businesses are going from pillar to post before they even start doing their own business. Then the issue of tampering with exchange control obviously is the issue of National Treasury, because they, and the Reserve Bank, they have their own stipulated rationale for some of the things, and I think Dr. Andrews correctly argues that we do believe that in South Africa, between the private sector and the DFIs, there is a lot of money that is that could be accessed. Yes, the FDIs as being proposed as the one way of raising capital is also welcome, but we do need to make a case. For instance, when we're analyzing the banks, as an example, we said, and I think Member Mbutu will come on this point, we said that it's so easy in South Africa to get a loan for consumption, but difficult to get a loan for production, for productive activities like forming a business and so on and so on. That's the main problem that we are facing. And the DFIs, in our own assessment from what is being presented to us, they're almost operating more or worse than the banks in terms of their requirements, not considering that they are dealing with entrepreneurs. And at the center of their argument is that entrepreneurs, obviously, we are not painting everybody with the same brush. Once they get this access to resources and they flourish, they veer off from the main course of business and they do other things which really are not desirable. And as a result, some of the businesses fail because of activities that are not aligned to businesses. So this is one other area that we need to be looking at. And I think that I am persuaded on this idea that for innovative businesses, not necessarily only startups, including the big ideas or existing businesses, we might need to think hard enough about the possibility of the SCZ, because that's where tax break and rebates and all those things are made. But also we could use that SCZ to really, I know in South Africa we've got those what are those Science and Technology Institute? They're small for research and for R&D. All those things could be located there so that we can have access to immediate research and development to ensure that our businesses expand. In South Africa, the number of businesses that are registered, and then CIPC people will help us with the numbers, vis-a-vis what we think is a potential, there is a complete disjoint. So we don't have enough registered businesses that are supported, that are thriving. At all times, we are lacking in that space. The last point I want to raise is that as a DTIC, we are pursuing industrialization for this term. And we are fully aware that even though you term yourself startups, some of the innovation are huge. Looking at the turnover and investment and all those things are huge. Some are technologically based, AI based, and so on and so on. But some are industry based, like Yoko, this whole thing. If we look at the manufacture, not just the software, the manufacturing of the actual instrument is what will be as DTIC will be interested in, to ensure that it's not a product from China using the technology that has been developed by the entrepreneur who presented and so on. I'm just making that as an example in the way. I do think that for me, for us to take this discussion forward, it appears that the Department of Small Business, Department of Treasury, Department of Home Affairs, DTIC, and other important role players, including the DFIs and those who are holding the pension funds, because the skewed manner in which they are investing ignores some of the groundbreaking ideas that are held by our entrepreneurs. As a result, the alternative now that we're looking at is the external FDI funding into South Africa. So that will be my contribution. I know that there's issues of visas and all those things. All those things can be grouped under one. If in the SZZ, those are the required things. We are really pursuing issues of economic growth and jobs this term. So would like to see or to know from yourself, how would initiative like this contribute significantly if all the support mechanisms are in place? And then I think the issue of the legislation and all that thing, outside of the legal advice from our guys after we've met everybody, I don't think that is anything that we can on the spot commit to. So because we need to ensure that we are properly legally advised based on the legal environment in South Africa. I would still want to take other members if they have their hands, but if not, then I will allow you, Mani and Mari, to respond to the questions that are there. Maybe they will be provoked. Thank you very much. So you can respond.
Marie, would you like to start?
Happy to. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, delegates. Thank you for the question. So I think I'd like to start with the theme really of what makes a startup, because I think we've heard that in some of the questions and interventions. So as you've rightly spelled out, Chair Messina, not all startups are small and medium-sized enterprises. Very few of them are micro enterprises, and most definitely not all small and medium-sized enterprises are startups. I touched on it very briefly when I spoke about labeling, but I'd like to just give you a definition, which is the definition that has been developed and used by the African Union in the model law and startup policy framework. And it focuses on three important components. Startups are defined as innovative, capital-intensive businesses which dedicate substantial resources to researching and developing technology-enabled products and or services in response to perceived or anticipated market demand, in the process generating valuable intellectual property assets. So there are three key components here. One is the innovative component, innovative resulting in a significant allocation of funding to research and development, which results in intellectual property as an important asset, and innovation also focusing specifically on technology-enabled products and services. And then the third component, which ties in with that, is the capital-intensive nature of it. Now, this definition is difficult to use as a legal definition, which is why all the Startup Acts globally have opted to not rely on a definition, but instead on a series of criteria, which are called labeling criteria, which apply in combination of each other. In some countries, it's an either or. If you fall into that category, you don't have to fulfill that labeling criteria. In others, if you fall into a particular industry, for instance, then certain criteria are lower or higher than if you fall into a different industry, simply cognizant of the fact that different industry and startups in different industry have different requirements. And Chair Messina, you just spoke about manufacturing, for instance. It's a very important sector. Advanced technologies play a critical role in spearheading the industrialization that we want to see on the continent. And in the manufacturing space, startups have a very different markup compared to a services space, for instance. To specifically answer your question, Mr. Ndlozi, with regards to turnover, out of all the Startup Acts that exist globally, only 3 have chosen to have a turnover requirement. Only one of them is in Africa, that's Tunisia, the other 2 being Malta and Italy. In the case of Malta, the turnover criteria is an optional criteria, not a hard criteria. In the case of Italy and Tunisia, it's a hard criteria. It's a criteria of 5 million euros. I'm afraid I don't have the rent number at hand for that. It's 5 million euros in both of those markets. And both of those markets, as a consequence of that, have refrained from having a time allocation. So the startup label exists for an indefinite period, and the company graduates when it is above that threshold. Other countries have chosen a different route. Nigeria, for instance, which is the newest Startup Act on the continent, I think only by about 2 weeks. DRC, Nigeria, sort of at the same level in terms of when they've adopted their Startup Act. Nigeria opted, for instance, to not have a turnover limit, but instead to have a limit of 10 years of operation. And allow me to just point this out. So in Nigeria, for instance, eligible startups, so companies, in order for them to be considered a startup under the Startup Act, have to be registered as a limited company, limited liability company, may not be in existence for more than 10 years, must have innovation, development, production, improvement, and commercialization of digital technology, innovative products and processes as the business objective and core operating focus, must be a holder or repository of a digital product, process, or an author of a registered software, and must have at least 1/3 of its local shareholding being held by Nigerians as a founder or a co-founder. And then there are certain criteria under which this last criteria can be loosened, which is a long list, which I'm not going to read out. This is a fairly standard sort of definition of how startups are being treated globally in Startup Acts, as well as across the continent. So the focus is really on innovative businesses that are capital intensive as a consequence of the research and development in the technology space. And then the focus really is on the generation of the assets. That means that these startups are critical for enabling the growth of SMEs. So that's where SMEs come into the play, and you saw it on the slides. And I know there was a question, I believe from Mr. Mzazane. That's where the enablement of SMEs come up. So startups very often enable the growth of SMEs, and we've heard this from Yoko, for instance, with regards to the payment method. It has absolutely revolutionized the way we see SMEs being able to engage in direct payments in South Africa. So the SMEs are enabled by the startups, but startups are very often not SMEs, and definitely not all SMEs are startups. And then before I hand over to Alia, allow me to just go to a second question with regards to special economic zones. We see some countries on the continent currently experimenting with dedicated special economic zones, specific for startups, very often more specific with regards to the type of startup that is targeted. And a really good example here is Triffic, the Two Rivers Industrial and Special Economic Zone for innovation and technology-enabled corporations in Kenya, Triffic. And Triffic has a specific focus on startups, and it combines both a physical special economic zone in the outskirts of Nairobi with digital special economic zones across the country. But they have a specific focus on what is called the gig economy, or the future of work, which is a very particular subset of digitally enabled and technology-enabled businesses. And that is driven largely by a focus on job creation particularly for freelancers, so not in the employment space. And it was specifically developed not to replace the Startup Act. Kenya is in the final stretches of adopting its Comprehensive Startup Act, but it was developed to allow for certain sandbox experimentations or regulatory sandboxes, specifically in the labor space, specifically for freelancers. So we can see that special economic zones provide an opportunity to try policies and regulations in sandboxes. They provide an opportunity to incentivize very specific subsects of the economy. However, they do not replace the benefits that we can see from comprehensive startup acts. And that very often ties back to the fact that many startups are founded not with the intent of being a startup that is labeled and applies for certain incentives, but they grow there. And we know that more startups fail than proceed. And having a comprehensive startup act apply across the nation can significantly reduce the number of startups that fail. But for that, it has to apply across the nation and not only in dedicated spaces. I thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Before I start, I'd actually just like to tag in Vellani, who hasn't yet had an opportunity to speak, and I know has some perspectives on things like the definition of a startup or a business that can have an impact. So Vellani, tagging you in here just for some of your perspectives.
Much appreciated, Alia, and good afternoon to the members of the committee and my fellow entrepreneurs in the journey. So I think for me, I really want to just share a very simple approach on this. I think, the key challenges in South Africa we can all agree upon is poverty, unemployment, and inequality. I mean, this theme and the need to address it is relatively consistent amongst all political parties and public servants. But what I really understand about emerging economies and the kind of attitude that we need to take in South Africa is similar to what China did over 40 years ago, which is give a man a fish, you feed them for a day. If you teach them how to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. But the question then is, how do ordinary South Africans get a hand up rather than a handout? And I think high growth startups enable that. And really, there's three components about this, and that's the missing middle, the job creation, and how does this reach ordinary man on the street? When we look at the economy, as Chesden had mentioned earlier in the day, that we typically have two structures in South Africa. We have small business, and then we have big corporate. But we really kind of forget about the missing middle, which I sincerely believe is the high growth engine that will enable our success, especially when it comes to teaching someone how to fish and feed them for a lifetime. And for us, that missing middle is your medium to large enterprise, which employs between 50 to 500 people. And these guys represent competition to big corporate as they move faster and have systems in place. But most importantly, they also become potential customers to smaller businesses with better payment terms, right? And so they also create the most meaningful jobs in the sense that they upskill workers, they create equity options, and they give more responsibility relative to the rate of growth, and usually encourage a culture of upskilling people below you. So this is really, really important, because when we think about South Africa's economy and the propensity to create jobs, the missing middle is the business case rather than an exception to the business case. Now, if we take this down to job creation, we all believe, or at least I believe, that it's very important for us to target reducing unemployment by a third. We're currently sitting at about 33% unemployment. Imagine what that would be if unemployment just went down to 22%, which ironically is about 4% higher than Ethiopia, who is one of the new admitted countries to the BRICS bloc. If you look at the numbers, we have about 8.2 million unemployed people, we have about 2.6 million small and medium-sized businesses, of which 37% are formal, which represents roughly 1 million people. And then if you look at the bracket between small, medium, and large businesses, which on average range from anywhere between 10 million Rand a year in revenue up to 100 million Rand, this is about 80,000 businesses. If you take those businesses and you tell them to set a job creation target in order to slash unemployment, those people would have to, or those businesses would each need to create 32 jobs to reduce unemployment by a third. So 32 jobs. And if you ask Katlego at Yoko, you ask Cheslin at Time, you ask Melvin at Go One, how quickly they were able to create 32 jobs, they can probably tell you that after reaching a certain stage of their growth, it was relatively easy. And why this is important is that if we have this enabling framework that the Startup Act would enable, you would see a lot more Yokos, a lot more Time Banks, a lot more Go Ones, and a lot more Lulas coming through that can create those 32 jobs to help us reduce unemployment by at least a third. But the real question here is, then how does this reach the ordinary man on the street? Because we know as politicians and public servants, we can use all the big jargon and language, but how does this affect the ordinary man on the street? And I'll break it down into 3 key steps. The first is that the employees who work for these companies typically get share options. And we know that a salary is income, but shares is wealth. Secondly, once the company exits or gets acquired or lists on a stock exchange, there's typically a windfall of income that usually exceeds the salary that these employees would get. That windfall, alongside the skills, knowledge, and network learned whilst working at companies like Yoko, Time, Go One, allow these employees to repeat the same success that they had if they were to start their own companies. However, we know that South Africans are very community focused, and they would take some of those proceeds and put that in their cousin in Umlazi's school fees, or buy their grandmother in Manenberg a home, or become that wealthy uncle or aunt who funds their nephew's new business idea. So ultimately, what I'm sharing with you guys is that ultimately it is a sustainable way to enable South Africans to lift themselves up in a meaningful way that most big corporations are unlikely to do at the pace at which our high growth businesses can do. And it's also very similar to how China lifted over 300 million people out of poverty in 40 years. So this is just essentially what I wanted to share with the audience at large, that engaging with high growth startups is the business case rather than the exceptional business case. Hope I've made my points clear. Alia, over to you.
Thank you, Villani. I think that multiplication and amplification impact of this category of business is the thing we need to emphasize here. And just to the point and the question around enablement beyond just jobs, maybe Katlego, you could answer the question around the SMEs that Yoko has enabled and the funding and the card processing model behind that.
Thanks, Alia. Yeah, happy to provide some additional clarity on some of the questions that came up. So yeah, we're now enabling 200,000 businesses on the platform now on an annual basis. And it's quite amazing. I mentioned that 8 out of those 10 businesses are taking card payments with us for the first time. I think the deeper message around this is these businesses were previously dealing in cash and were also previously dealing in pen and paper, right? And Excel sheets and the like. And now all of a sudden, through our platform, they're now creating verified financial records and history and subsequently begin to exist. And also now tracking what they sell in the digital platform versus pen and paper. So what this allows us to do is we're now able to advance these businesses' capital, because we can see how much they're trading in real time, and we can score them in real time. And subsequently, we can advance them their future turnovers within 24 hours, and they can pay that back to the machine. And that's where the 2 billion rands in disbursement number comes from. Is we've been able to not only facilitate payments for these businesses, but also give them a line of access to their future turnover, which is really critical for working capital. Whether it's buying inventory or paying salaries, this is very, very important. So that's where this comes from. And I think there was just also a question around the 50 billion number. So this is how much volume is being processed through the platform on an annual basis.
Thank you, Katlego. I think just to add to that point, and what Velani and Katlego has said, and that they're possibly too humble to say as well, they've grown exceptionally fast, and you see exceptional numbers on their slides and their growth stories, but they also started somewhere. And having advised many businesses like these, I think the pace at which they were able to impact South Africa could have been accelerated significantly had the regulatory framework and the funding available in South Africa, if that foundation had been different and that picture had been different. And you heard from Velani as well about the impact of these medium to large businesses, and the multiplication impact of that, which is a different profile compared to the white monopoly capital, if we want to use those terms. So important to say, regardless of definitions, and regardless of how we frame these things, when the qualifying startups, as we define it in our presentation, are the ones who we're going to define as are able to receive these dispensations, and are the ones that by definition will make the kind of impact we need to see in the world. I see there's a question from Toby, but I do have some other responses on the questions that have been raised, but maybe I should hand over to Toby at first.
Go ahead with your agreement, Chair. Let's let Alia carry on, and then I'll ask my question.
Okay, perfect. So there were a couple of questions on access to funding, in particular in South Africa. There is funding available in South Africa, and in fact has had some of an impact. But just for context, I think important to understand that the size available, just in terms of sheer volume and capital available to South African startups, is much lower than actually what's needed by our businesses to expand. So we know, for example, that the PIC and the SA SME Fund have invested in these categories of businesses, but Time Bank alone has raised more capital than 2.5 times the PIC's total VC investment to date. So it's not that there is no funding available and that funding hasn't had an impact, and we have lots of examples of entrepreneurs that have received some funding, but it is not enough. And I think that is part of the problem, that we need foreign investment to amplify what is available. And then on the red tape reduction unit, and the steps that have already been taken by government to support startups. I understand that they approached the Startup Act movement 2 years ago, but their mandate was quite limited. And so they were focusing on the mining sector, the grassroots SMEs, and have since not had sufficient capacity or bandwidth to address and support the high growth entrepreneurs that we're talking about today. Could we do with more red tape reduction? Of course, we welcome it, and that's the underpinning of what we're suggesting today. Are there quick fixes or a reduction in process or administrative intensive ways in which this can be done, of course. And I think that's probably the low-hanging fruit that can make a difference. But I would say that from our experience, the issue isn't just the early stage, the creation of the company through SIP-C, but what happens after that in terms of the administration of the businesses, and getting things through to the South African Reserve Bank via authorized dealers at the various commercial banks. And 9 times out of 10, those processes not only are complex and require expensive advisors, but also take too long, and the outcomes of those processes are very uncertain. So it's not just the content of the regulations, but how these regulations are enforced in practice by the bodies that control them. So it's a process problem, and it is a substance problem as well. And process is sometimes easier to solve than substance, but ultimately both need to be solved. And as to the question on the engagement with the South African Reserve Bank, there have been engagements with the South African Reserve Bank for at least 10 years. And in fact, to their credit, and National Treasury's credit, there have been some dispensations and relaxations. Unfortunately, they didn't go far enough, and the conditions attached to those relaxations, as well as sometimes the conditions attached to the funding from some of these local providers, made it difficult for startups, this kind of startups we're talking about today, to accept them. And so the impact is unfortunately not felt in the way one would hope or one would intend. And I think it's not for lack of trying in some cases. I think there have been unintended consequences of policy decisions. And that's why one of our recommendations was a deep understanding of the reality on the ground in running these businesses. I think there were other questions around foreign skills impact and what that means. I think, of course, there's going to be an impact on employees here, but we think the bigger impact is really going to be around the transfer of skills and the enablement of people through being trained and supported by foreign skilled workers, as well as the fact that these businesses need these skills in order to compete on the global stage. And we do need these businesses to compete on the global stage, not just to attract funding, but to attract customers, to grow their revenue base, which obviously has a longer term impact on our economy. And finally, as to one of the qualifying criteria for a startup that's available or could access this dispensation, I think one of the things we said about job creation is we would recommend, and I think most high growth entrepreneurs, especially ones as patriotic as the ones you've just seen on this call, would be open to criteria which require, for example, an R&D and operational entity in South Africa that employs jobs, which might go some way to alleviating some of these concerns. Are there any material questions I've missed, and happy to try and answer them or send through material after the fact to address those? Okay.
Is that all? Are you fine?
Yes, I think that's fine for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just check if there's any further hands.
Mr. Chance and Dr. Ndlozi, Chair.
Okay. Please come through, Member Chance, and then Member Ndlozi, you'll follow next.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks for the questions and answers. I think what's coming out quite clearly here is that in terms of the definition of a startup, we're dealing with a category change here, a category of business which South Africans haven't really got to grips with in the past. I think that goes to Dr. Ndlozi's point earlier. And I think that South Africa, when we talk about startups, we think about, mom and pop startups, 1 or 2 businesses that are trying to make a living, maybe in township or rural areas, and is struggling, which is a perfectly reasonable definition of startup. But the startup that we're talking about here is on a completely different scale. And as Mari mentioned, in her definition, in the innovation, access to capital, and IP elements, mainly is attempting to play on the global stage, and that's what I think differentiates these types of businesses. They're becoming globally competitive, and in order to become globally competitive, they have to scale. So this is, I think, what we need to grapple with as a committee, is how do we take this thing forward if it's something that is going to be cross-cutting in terms of different departments. That can't be answered in this meeting, but it certainly raises the question. Then I think in terms of legislation, if you look at the section 12J amendment to the Income Tax Act, which was introduced about 10 years ago. That was the Treasury's first attempt to incentivize investment into startups through the formation of venture capital companies. But then after a number of years, they closed it down because it was being abused. What I mean by that is that the Treasury said that it was actually attracting capital into businesses that weren't actually venture capital, quite a few property companies, game reserves, and so on. And I think that that's just an indication of how this nettle of the startup hasn't been grasped properly, hasn't been fully appreciated and understood. So I think what we're going to need to do is to convene a meeting. Either we convene it or the minister convenes it, of the Home Affairs, small business. There's going to have to be a sort of a roundtable discussion as to how this thing gets done, and how we can have a mindset shift, a step change, really, to make it possible to South Africa to enter the space of highly competitive, globally competitive, scalable businesses that access vast amounts of capital, and where do we get it from? So thanks. And I think that the question that Dr. Ndlozi asked, he may want to ask it again. The DA5s simply don't seem to feature here. The NEF, that IDC, as far as I can see, none of the three startups that have presented to us have accessed those sources of capital at all. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they could answer that question. But why is it? Why are we missing the boat here? Thank you, Chair.
Member Ndlozi, and then we'll be followed by Member Kigaba.
Thanks, Chairperson. Indeed, so the latter comments by Honorable Chance have covered me, because I'm saying that it would be useful for us that you indicate in categorical terms if the IDC, the NEF, the ECIC, Export Credit Insurance Corporation of South Africa, have been involved with any of you. Because we are the portfolio committee on trade and industry. These are people we can immediately bring into the picture to not only workshop, but to win them on the idea of rethinking funding along the lines of startup companies. And I'm convinced because you would know, as the chairperson indicated, we're interested in massive industrialization as a key objective for the 7th Parliament oversight. What we're going to be doing, we've agreed, is if the term ends, what we would like to have said is an achievement is if we have contributed in driving the discourse, policies, and actual manifestation on the ground of large-scale industry. That is not in any way to look down at small SMMEs. And I was saying, you would all remember, honorable members, that. So from what I'm hearing, you might want to use the story of Sasol. Sasol firm, which was a government startup. It's now worth over close to 100 billion rands. Or Toyota. Toyota was an innovative company started by the state, and this line, it's not expected to make money immediately. This is the golden line. They give them 10 years. They say, we're going to help you, and you have 10 years to turn around. That is not the language, if you think about it, honorable members, when it comes to SMMEs, and certainly IDC, ECIC, and NEF, even the Black Empowerment Commission. This is not the attitude that we put money, we put 5 billion rands, and we say in 10 years, and startups are modeled to say that in 10 years we can quadruple that money, or we can, and there's been this or that proof. So if you've got through these three entities of the DTIC and many others, I mean, the Competition Commission was claiming as well to be involved, the Gambling Board, they're involved in funding. If there can be, and we win people on, these are companies that immediately, number one, they become public. They are public companies. Number two, 10 years, we can agree on the period, innovation-based, high-tech, capital-intensive. What you need to add for the South African situation is labor-intensive as well. Is that as much as possible, they must create a type of job that must immediately be qualified as a sustainable job, as a category in the startup. That if we give this company 5 billion rands now, which IDC and all of them can do before the banks. I get the banks, I get foreign direct investment and all of that, but I'm sure the three companies that we've just looked at now, if when you were starting you were given 5 billion, I'm sure you would be far. It would have been a massive, and from the profiles that you have given us, none of these institutions that are expounding money have been in your radar. We need an understanding in relation to that. And then you have to break down, it seems to me, Chair, this question of commercialization of intellectual property. We need to win that argument as well, because there are conversations of amendment bills with the patents and intellectual property laws. So one, it's large scale. Two, at the center is innovation, research, innovation, with possibilities of the actual products. So you have to use that language of South Africa, that it's industrialization, it's localization, because you are speaking and you are outside the South African lexicon, but you want to convince South Africans. So I'm saying that all those terminologies are actually useful to ground or to foreground the uniqueness, as it were, of the startup. So those are my, and then the last thing is, what did the red tape thing, have you had an interaction with the red tape unit in the presidency? I'm interested to hear, did they help? Do you have any evidence of a business that they may have helped? I think it's been in place for the last 3-4 years, that unit. I seem to remember Ramaphosa speaking about it right at the beginning of his term of office. I don't remember, but I was trying to search now what were the years. So can you help us in that sense? Like how much of help have startup companies received from the red tape unit? So I missed the number. You said how many startup companies are part of your movement in South Africa? Can you just give me that figure as well? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Kikaba.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, look, I think I'm broadly covered and colleagues have spoken quite well. I appreciate the presentations. So there is a bit of work which I suppose both the colleagues that were making the presentations and us need to do to identify two levels of engagement. One is, or maybe three. One is the role that we as the portfolio committee have to play going forward in advocacy, at advocacy level. Secondly, identify what we would advocate for the DTIC family to do in support of this work. And thirdly, to identify partners in government, such as the National Treasury, Department of Small Business, the to be formed state-owned holding company on SOEs, but prior to its formation, because it's going to take a long time to establish, engage the department currently responsible for shareholding responsibility, so that we harness all the resources at our disposal. One of the problems really where we've made, and one of the reasons why we've made slow progress in many respects, particularly in respect of supporting startup businesses and small and medium businesses, is the dispersion of responsibility at the level of government in particular, because that's where resources are commanded and that's where they get directed. But because many departments act in silos, you then don't have sufficient support for businesses. And as a startup business, it's difficult without sufficient capital to be moving from one department to the next. You are sometimes alone, or you are two, or you are three. You then spend the rest of your time running in between departments and having to deal with egos and red tape and other such things, short-sightedness.
And bribery.
Hello? Okay. So it becomes difficult for you to run around to achieve your objectives of starting up and focusing on the business, because while you are busy running around, it's difficult to focus on the core business of your business. But it's very important to do all of that, Chair, because we want, the South African economy faces several structural problems. And in addition to those structural problems, it faces the issue of the need to transform the patterns and relations of ownership, so that we create, we transfer capital to as many people as possible. And so supporting these initiatives is very vital, in light also of the fact, as Dr. Ndlozi had earlier stated, that we tend to be very myopic in terms of our conceptualization of small business. And so we need to broaden our conceptualization and be bold and ambitious in terms of our plans. And there are many areas where startup and small businesses should have been involved, including in the infrastructure space. As we are busy diversifying the sources of energy generation, as we are busy reforming some of the freight logistics areas, we should be very clear that we want to see South African companies getting involved in those areas, not just foreign companies that already come in with capital, because the very reason why in the late 1900s and particularly in the early in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, why many of these SOEs, such as ISCO, Eskom, Transnet, South African Railways at the time, were established, was to industrialize the South African economy and localize it and show that South Africa's capital was circulated within the country between the mining sector and the industrial sector. And so that's what we need to try and achieve. So I support the work that we are doing, but I think we will be amiss to leave this meeting without setting up processes through you, Chair. And I'm not saying we should do it in the meeting, but through further engagement that will ensure that we are able to achieve all of this level of coordination. There are limits to what we, as members of parliament, can do, but there is also a lot that we can do if we really weigh in and pull all our resources towards what we can achieve here. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think the attitude of the committee is that we welcome this engagement, and we do have sets of proposals in terms of how we see us taking this forward, and thirdly that we think that this will require a collaborative effort with other departments so that we can streamline some of the things. And then fourthly, there are initiatives that we think are possible, which could be explored in terms of the practical things that we can do as the DTIC. And fifthly, that we will be consulting with the legal with regard to after we've met with other departments, what are the propositions that we're making with regard to either introducing the new act or relooking into existing act, and that determination cannot be made at this point in time. It can only be made upon us having been advised by the legal people who deals with different legislation. And there's a very strong sense, as Member Kigaba and Member Chance and Member Ndlozi have said, that we are talking the same thing, probably same objective, but we're using different language. So we might need to find ways in which, in the South African context, we can align the language of how we call things, because it's very, very important. Otherwise, we can be seen to be encroaching in other areas, whereas there's a greater appreciation of what we are dealing with in terms of the presentations and what you've been able to articulate here. So this is what we take, and I think the team will produce the minutes. As Member Kigaba is saying, we'll then have to agree on the way forward. What is the first practical step? What can we do to mobilize some of these entities? For instance, will it be in your interest to meet directly with the red tape team, or must we invite them to come to us to explain to us so that we're able to share that kind of information? Secondly, with the DFIs and the banks, there will have to be greater engagements, including pension funds, on the role in which they play in this is in support of the ventures of the magnitude that we're speaking about here. So these are some of the things that are coming up. So I would want to give you for the next 8 minutes to conclude, and our meeting will be off at 12. Concluding remarks from yourselves as a team. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to respond to those. First of all, we really do appreciate any opportunity to engage with any committees or forums within government on these things. And perhaps quickly just to respond to a few questions on the red tape unit. Unfortunately, it hasn't had the impact we would have liked, I think mostly because of bandwidth, and their focus at the time was on mining and sort of grassroots startups, so I haven't seen that impact. There are definitely low-hanging fruit opportunities. There are definitely process opportunities, and there are opportunities to facilitate large impacts on startups that don't necessarily require a large startup act and massive changes to legislation. As much as we are proponents of a Startup Act and are part of the Startup Act movement, exchange control, for example, requires a policy change to the exchange control framework that isn't a large legal change and can be implemented quite quickly. So just to say as an overarching comment, it will be good to separate short-term and long-term quick wins. And then I think very important to understand the impact of DFIs and the like. And there I want to hand over to Cheslin just to answer the question about experience in the space, and then Devilani after him, and Malvin.
Yeah, so thanks, Ali, and thanks for the question. So Dr. Laws is to address your question specifically around BIC, IDC, and other potential funding avenues in the country. Time Bank was actually turned down by the BIC in Series A of our capital raise at the very, very beginning. And not a single one of these entities have then put their hand up to participate in any other subsequent rounds. So we haven't been the beneficiary of any of such funding in South Africa. And the second part is, I think what has been proposed here, and I think Toby Chance mentioned it earlier, it's been done. It's been done in multiple other countries around the world. So the recipes are there. So we're not trying. I don't think the SA Startup Association is trying to reinvent the wheel here. And again, please forgive my ignorance. So with all due respect, it's about willingness. It's about a desire to want to make these changes. And there are really, really good examples. We've opened bank number 2 in the Philippines, a completely different structural environment to operate in, and our business is flying there. We're considering opening another bank in Southeast. And just to get those businesses off the ground, to get capital deployed into those businesses has been a lot more seamless than it has been in South Africa. So I think it most probably boils down to what mandates these institutions are given in the offset, and those mandates need to be made very, very clear. So we haven't been the beneficiary. And then on the red tape thing, our only solution to red tape to date has been very expensive lawyers' fees. And to be quite honest, we don't see any change in the very near future. We purchased a business in South Africa, a South African business, Time Bank purchased just over 2 years ago. And the amount of money we had to pay in lawyers' fees to get that deal over the line, the opportunity cost of where we could have deployed that capital elsewhere to grow the business even further is just counterintuitive to what we're trying to do. And I think, again, like I just want to reiterate, it goes back to what Toby said at the very start. This has been done. We're not trying to reinvent anything. There's multiple examples of where this is working around the world. And everything in South Africa lends itself to make exactly the same thing happen here. Like I said, this country presents tons and tons of opportunities for businesses to arise and help the country move forward. But we've got to create a framework and environment that facilitates it, that makes it easy for businesses to excel, that makes it easy for business to attract capital and talent. And if we get that right, reducing unemployment by 1/3 is not that hard a job to do, right? But the environment must allow for that to happen. I'll leave it there, Ali. I'm sorry, I'm also at the airport. I've got to jump off the call as well, otherwise I'm going to miss my flight. Thank you all.
So I'll just echo some of the sentiments that Cheslin shared in regards to Honorable Ndlozi and Honorable Gigaba's sentiments. I think the key thing here is to give some low-hanging fruit as action steps. It is two words, is representation and participation. The first is, when you look at funds like the IDC, NEF, and PIC, a lot of the people in the room, whether it be on the boards or in the investment committees, are not representative of the founders in this room who understand what it takes to build businesses like this. So you get set unrealistic expectations, like to show profitability in year one of your business, when we know that it takes 5 years to break even with these high growth businesses because they are capital intensive and they're growing relatively rapidly. So I'd really like to encourage the committee to really just consider, when it's the board seats or the management of these agencies, to really, with a deliberate effort of representation of founders like Katlego, like Cheslin, like Melvin and myself on these committees to help influence the decisions. Because, when you follow a process that says submit a business plan and 3-year financials, a lot of our companies submit business model canvases instead of business plans, but no one is at the table or in the room influencing, saying that the way these processes have been set up are not really relevant for the current way in which high growth businesses take place. And obviously, one other key thing is when you look at trade delegations. I remember a few weeks ago we had FOCAC. You had a lot of big business be there with the president, but I didn't see Katlego from Yoko. I didn't see Melvin from Gowan or Cheslin. And those platforms can enable these companies to be the success stories that we need them to be. So that's just some low-hanging fruit with great humility to our public servants here today. Melvin, over to you.
No, thanks for that. And I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of representation. I think to the point raised by both Honorable Ndlozi and Honorable Igaba, it's the point of translation. So maybe there's a function of misunderstanding the terms, but I think one is language, but two is understanding. And I think often the process understanding is missing. I think in our experience, earlier in our journey, we did look at the BIC program through DTI and unsuccessful there. But if you even compare our experiences, for example, going through a DD process with the IDC, not only the information requested, but the time it takes. By the time you actually get your approval, your business may no longer exist. And I mean, early on in our journey, our Series B, a South African investor had approached us. And the process took so long that in the end, Microsoft and the US said, look, Marvin, we'll put the money into the business, it's fine. And you'd expect a South African investor or DFI to understand your business better than an American company. And so the question is, how do we begin those conversations earlier and be sure that it is actually trying to say, how do we grow those local enterprises more globally? And so I think this is a preamble to a longer conversation, but I think it's important for us to land on what does success look like, which I think is very clear. If you can, one, improve the environment, improve jobs, and not to make it conducive for entrepreneurs such as ourselves and those coming after us, I think that would be a win. And to the point said earlier, probably a low-lying fruit for us to achieve.
Marie?
Thank you, Alia. I just wanted to take a minute to emphasize the point that Cheslin just made with regards to not reinventing the wheel. President Cyril Ramaphosa was among the presidents who mandated the African Union Commission to develop a model law, and the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition was among those represented during the Council of Ministers that adopted both the model law as well as the roadmap for implementation in the form of a Startup Act. I know the language can be scary, so to Melvin's point, it's about understanding, but the act itself, the implementation itself is not scary. The blueprint is there, the guidance is there, excellent examples from around the world are there, and the evidence in terms of the impact that we can have with these actions is there. So I thank you for the time today.
Thank you. So in closing, lots of low-hanging fruit, and for the long-term piece, a very clear framework that is supported by many countries and examples within Africa of success stories. So open to the committee's viewpoints on how we take this forward and how we can contribute to the processes.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, can we request you maybe to share with the Secretariat, Andre, the whatever documentations that are there that could be helpful for us to just have a look, including the presentation for the purposes of the record. And then we will then be able to develop a way forward, and we'll share it with yourselves in terms of how we think we can move forward, given the number of proposals that I've already alluded to coming from members. With that, can I officially then close the meeting? Thanks to everyone who's been there. Thanks to the team. Thanks to everyone who presented, the professional manner in which you've conducted yourselves. Thank you to honorable MPs for making time even during recess. This is the kind of commitment that we need to serve South Africa. With that, thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.